Well, on SABC News also spoke to former President Thabo Mbeki on the short-lived internal revolt by the Wagner Group in Russia on Saturday. Take a look.
It was a bit too early. Now that they've listened to both, I hope they come back and sit and say, let's go back with specific proposals on the basis of what we've had. But it's important, I think it was important that the Africans must intervene, because in any case, that conflict is impacting practically on the continent. Shortages of fertilizer. So some regions on the continent are going to suffer food shortages because of that. Shortage even of wheat. It's impacting directly on the continent. The general cost of living has gone up, impacts on us. So as Africans, we must be interested to see that war end as soon as possible.
Right, so let's discuss this further. We're going to be joined via Zoom by Professor Malte Brosig, Professor in International Relations at Wits. A very good afternoon to you, Professor Malte. Thank you for your time with us here on the SABC.
Yeah, thanks for having me and good afternoon.
So we're obviously looking at developments unfolding at this point, and we've heard a number of inputs from around the world. What's your opinion on Putin's power in terms of position, or in terms of power in Russia? Was Putin's weaknesses exposed? Was the Russian political system exposed? What's being unearthed as we see these developments?
Yeah, I mean, what we know since the beginning of the war last year is that, the Kremlin was very much at the center here. Russia changed actually from a more autocratic to an totalitarian regime, and everything was now concentrating on the army and defense forces here. What we've seen over the weekend then is a slightly different story in terms of there are different centers of power. So you have the Ministry of Defense, the Russian troops in Ukraine, and the mercenaries with the Wagner Group, and President Putin was not necessarily the one single person in charge of the entire country. Certainly there are gaps in power that are opening up, but of course we'll have to wait and see what consequences this brings about.
Thank you for that context, Prof. I think we're obviously looking at how this impacts the geopolitical landscape and what it really means for the Russia-Ukraine war as we speak.
Okay, this is of course speculative. As we could see, I mean, most countries at the moment are opting for a wait-and-see strategy. I would not assume that President Putin would disappear from power immediately or anytime soon, for example, but it's an internal weakening process that's taking place. But it's also very likely that the Kremlin will try to strike back. So as we know from contemporary history of Russia, that any kind of opposition figures don't really have a very long or comfortable life in the country. So that struggle might continue. And we can also speculate a little bit. I mean, it's not so likely that Prigozhin was acting in complete isolation. So there's, as it looks like, a bit of sympathy also from the lower ranks of the Russian army towards him. And although the Wagner Group is called a private military company, I mean, it's clearly part of the state security forces. And as well as the military intelligence service here. So it's a bit unlikely that he was just acting as a lone general here, starting a mutiny out of nothing here. So the question is, who else was backing him, and what are these other structures actually doing in the future? These are open questions, and I think they're a bit tricky to answer. But of course, Putin has to reestablish his lost power, and I think he'll use all means that he has available for that.
No, Prof, I'm glad you've touched on how Putin might reassert his power going forward. I want to look at how, in the wake of what transpired this past weekend, whether it's going to have any bearing on the peace mission that, of course, we saw earlier between the Ukraine as well as Russia and African leaders, and how this potentially also impacts the BRICS summit that's set to take place in South Africa a little later this year.
Yeah, let's start with the BRICS summit. Of course, in South Africa, where there was an intense debate about what to do if President Putin decides to travel to South Africa. Now, with the mutiny in his own country, that's extremely unlikely that he will attend the summit in person. So, from that perspective, one might say South Africa is off the hook now. So the problem is kind of solved here. With regard to the war and peace missions, there's no direct, at the moment, there's no measurable direct effect on how the war actually proceeds with regard to the Wagner mutiny. But we can, of course, see that it's extremely likely that the Wagner Group will be dismantled completely. This will have, I guess, more consequence for some other African countries where the Wagner Group is operational. And we'll see what effect it will have on the Russian forces when the Wagner troops are actually integrated into regular forces. So it's definitely not, there are no developments that actually make Russia look stronger here, but this certainly doesn't mean that the war will end soon or that the Russian troops will be crumbling soon here. The rest would be speculative.
What's your take on the state of the army or the military at this point, given the Russia-Ukraine war, and perhaps how strong they are, given the 16 months of fighting at this point?
Yes. What is interesting with regard to the Prigozhin episode now is that, you know, he was speaking freely, attacking the defense minister and the Russian military leadership. And the interesting part is here that I think that there was a lot of positive sentiment towards Prigozhin from the Russian lower-ranking forces here. So when he talked about corruption, mismanagement, and so on, I mean, this is something that many could actually directly relate to. So he was addressing somehow real issues, but of course also acting in his own self-interest here. And but it's not so likely that all the problems that do exist will just disappear overnight. So, and if the war from the Russian perspective does not progress further, then of course these problems might aggravate further. So there might be a slow process of let's say disintegration and cracks getting bigger. But for the immediate situation, you don't really see many repercussions right now.
Prof, let's leave that conversation there. Thank you for your time with us here on the SABC.